Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Plazen R podcast, where teachers and researchers come together to make knowledge together. Each episode offers thought provoking nuggets of autism research to support the Pan London Autism Schools Network as they meet at UCL. I'm Brian, and today I'm joined by the lovely Jess. Jess, hello.
Hello,
It's
Brian.
so good to have you. You are one of my favorite people to talk to about these kind of things. You have always been a wonderful font of wisdom. Before we go any further, would you like to tell everyone who you are, what brought you to Plazen, what your research is?
It's great to be here. Thank you, Brian. So, I am in the third year of my PhD looking at the inclusion of autistic educators in school, in their work, very much based on my own experiences at work as someone who has both struggled to access the school workplace as an autistic person and also in management responsibility roles, not been sure how to support other colleagues myself. And so inclusion being very much at the forefront of my mind, thinking about how we can improve inclusion in the school workplace. So that is what I've been driving towards for the last 2.5 years.
Oh, it sounds just like an amazing project. I love listening to PhD people just talking about the things that they're passionate by. I've got a couple of questions, and I will say I will try and my best to stick to the script. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to pass your way. I just want to hear your beautiful reflections upon them. So, I know that there are some good research bits into the experiences of autistic educators, and there are, I think, a handful of recommendations, probably even more than a handful these days. But we don't know what workplace inclusion measures actually look like. We don't know what is implementable by schools. Schools are these chaotic, messy places. Could you start off by telling us some things that our autistic teachers might want to look for in their places of education?
Sure. Yeah, there is some really great research into the experiences of autistic educators, very much led by Rebecca Wood, looking at experiences in the UK. That's now been moved over as well into the US, in Poland as well, which has been very interesting. And there's also lots of first-hand accounts. The focus for me is around inclusion, I think, because I'm starting to get a sense of autistic educators' experiences. But as you say, schools are busy, difficult places. We don't know yet what is implementable. What do school leaders think can be achieved? School leaders who are neurodivergent and neurotypical, what do they think they can achieve in their workplaces to make their workplaces more inclusive? So that is very much my focus there. There are some good recommendations out there. There is the recommendations by Kerno from, I think, 2024 that are out there that are interesting, that look at various supports, accommodations. There are other recommendations for supporting autistic educators from onboarding people. How do we support people when they're being onboarded into a school, into all of the nuances of work in day-to-day life, things that autistic people tend to find more challenging in accessing the school workplace often comes down to things like the crazy environment that schools are, both sound-wise, sensory-wise, crowdedness-wise, all of these things. And so a lot of the experiences that have been explored have been around that, as well as what I call like a heavy hitter, which is around communication in schools. People struggling to access some of the communication channels that are in schools as well.
Well, school communication channels in a busy school, isn't there?
Very much so. And so, yeah, the research that is there at the moment looks at some of those experiences. There are recommendations for things like accommodations, but I think the research around how we embed inclusion into the workplace and into those structures is still developing.
So that's the thing that have almost been gifted to you as a researcher. Your research itself. Tell me about your research. Tell me where you're coming from and where you're going to. What's the overall narrative and of the studies that you're doing?
Yeah, when I first got into this 3 years ago when I started looking at wanting to explore this research-wise, I was reading Learning from Autistic Teachers, which was edited by Rebecca Wood and also lovely people at Cray and places. And it was really illuminating for me to see that there were actually other autistic people working in schools. It's, I think, quite common for autistic people to feel like they are the only one in their workplace. And I, at that point, was both a teacher, but also managing within a department in my school and wondering if I'm struggling to access the workplace, maybe I have knowledge on how to improve the inclusion for other people. But no, I did not have the knowledge around what that looks like. So I thought if I'm struggling to access the workplace and I don't know how to support that for other people, this is something I want to explore. So the initial research was trying to understand inclusion, and I wanted to focus on inclusion and not accommodations because for a myriad of reasons, really. It can be tricky to access. There is a lot of stigma associated with receiving accommodations, especially I think in a school workplace where it's busy. People, regardless of their neurotype, are tired and finding things very difficult often. And so going down that accommodation route wasn't something that I thought I could do. And I thought, schools, we're good at inclusion. We live and
Mm,
breathe it every day with our
mm,
students. We do quality first teaching. We do all of these things all of the time. If I am in front of my class and there are 25 of them and 6 of them are autistic, another 5 are dyslexic, another 5 are ADHD, and the rest have on their student passports a mixture of these different things. And we as schools are learning to include students in the environment and also stretch and challenge them and make that a learning place for everyone. Why can't we do that with the wider organization? So I wanted to focus on inclusion. So that was the impetus. And so what we did at UCL is we put together an autistic advisory group, so 4 autistic educators with various experience working in UK schools. So from classroom teachers to teaching assistants to various other experiences. And with them and also my 2 lovely supervisors at UCL, we've been looking into inclusion. And we started off by actually just wondering what inclusion is and looks like. And I was initially very much focused on accommodations. I think just from like my own exigencies in the workplace, I was like, I need this, I need that in order to function at work. So we did a diary study. We asked autistic educators to recount their inclusion and exclusion over a month. And we then interviewed them afterwards, and they told us that actually, yes, there are accommodations and things that are helpful, but really inclusion is so much more than that. It's around the culture of schools.
it is. And cultures of schools are fascinating things because the teachers are in a minority. And I don't know if any stories came through. Did we have stories in where the pupils were actually more inclusive than the systems?
Yes, I would say so. A lot of said that there's no issue with the students accept them. In fact, where you're a neurodivergent teacher with neurodivergent students, you have that affinity and connection with the students quite often because of shared empathy, because of just quite often that innate understanding, which rings true to my own experiences. And it really is, it's the other elements of school life that can be quite challenging. Sometimes people say, "When I'm in front of my class, brilliant. The rest of the world doesn't exist. It's great." But it's outside of that that things can be quite challenging.
I think that's just one of the fundamental insights. I always had that as a gut feeling. And to have actually somebody now do the research about it, just incredible things. So when it comes to these big systems, if you had that magic bullet, if you had that how bit of culture that needed changing, what would be your first, I don't know, first part of the sculpture, first part of the craft?
So, once we got a sense from people that, okay, so inclusion, what does inclusion as a concept mean to autistic educators? There was this sense that there was the broader culture, there was a sense of the accommodations as well and how they interact. So the next bit really was to try and understand how those interact, which has led me to look at accommodations and cultures a bit more broadly. That involved a review and also more recently focus groups where I've been asking school leaders and teachers who are neurodivergent and neurotypical how to improve inclusion.
Oh, tell me.
And while we are going through the results, and I can't be definitive in any way about that, the things that it tends to come down to that I think are absolutely key and I think warrant a lot more exploration more broadly are things like the relational dynamics between people. And okay, yes, someone might have an accommodation at work, and perhaps a broader school culture or workplace culture more broadly is saying that they do this thing either in their policy or in their practice. But it's about how do we navigate the relationships on a day to day basis to do what? So, Nancy Doyle and Alma McDowell have written about this quite nicely, I think, talking about the mutual agreement of things. And really, the question of how do we mutually agree our relationships around autistic inclusion on a day to day level, I think that's where a lot of the
Mm.
questions lie.
So true. Agreeing is not a one-off thing. It's this ongoing process, this
Yeah.
mutual agreement, this mutual working towards understanding, this way of actually saying, this is what I see and this is what, and we can find somewhere just to shake hands on it. Mutuality also brings the idea of solidarity. And I know in my teaching experience, I was working with teachers who were a neurodivergent bunch. And this was back in the 90s before we really had that word to describe it. But there was something where they could stand together to try and find this agreement with the culture. Were there any stories of that solidarity rather than individual teachers fighting their own little battles of teachers banding together?
Really good question. I would say that where this idea of solidarity stood out was around neurodivergent leadership. And what was really lovely was being able to, across this research, engage with some amazing leaders in schools across the UK who are themselves neurodivergent and have been working in schools for decades, who have just brought such amazing insight into their own inclusive practices, which they are doing, yes, for themselves, but they're building that into their school systems to ensure that it's supporting everyone. And that's the staff, it's the students. So it's not so much, I would say, solidarity in terms of a group of people banding together in some way. I think it at the moment it's still more implicit. It's people who are in a position to enact change in their leadership roles, embedding inclusion somehow into their practices. And it's those particular practices that I'm hoping to draw out in this current stage of the research and the next stage.
Jess, thank you ever so much with that lovely story of hope in leadership. I think that's where we can wrap things up for this Plasm mini primer. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for listening in. We'll see you next time when we meet for the Pan London Autism Schools Network research meetings.